Hello, today I'm going to talk about Nikon SLR and DSLR lens mount. The lens mount for Nikon SLR and DSLR is called F mount. Even though all Nikon SLR and DSLR cameras use Nikon F lens mount, not all Nikon lenses fit all Nikon cameras. That's because the F mount has several variations. For example, this lens mount and this lens mount, they are both F mount, but they are different variations. Today, I will explain these variations and their compatibility with Nikon lenses. Nikon SLR starts with the 1959 Nikon F camera. That's why the lens mount is called F mount. This is the first variation of F mount. The mount on the F camera does not have any metering feature, meaning if you put any Nikon lens on a 1959 Nikon F camera, you don't have metering. Then people said, I want metering. Nikon says, okay, you can put a meter on top of the camera. As we know, metering is determined by three factors: the film or sensor ISO, shutter speed, and lens aperture. Film or sensor ISO and shutter speed are set on the camera body, while aperture is set on the lens. Therefore, in order for the meter to work, the camera needs to know the lens aperture. How does the meter on top of the camera know the lens aperture? Nikon's answer is to put a rabbit ear on the lens aperture ring. The rabbit ear will couple with the metering pin on the meter. When you turn the aperture ring, the rabbit ear will drag the pin to move so that the meter knows the aperture setting. All Nikon cameras and lenses made before 1977 use this metering mechanism. These cameras include Nikon F, F2 Photomic, F2S, F2SB, Nikon Rex, Nikon Mat FT, FTN, FT2, and EL. These cameras have the first variation of F mount. In 1977, Nikon decided to change the metering mechanism and developed the so-called auto-indexing, or AI technology. With AI technology, they don't use the lens rabbit ear to couple with the pin on the camera anymore. Instead, the lens bottom has an AI coupling ridge. On the camera body, there is a little metal tab called AI tab on the lens mount. The AI coupling ridge on the lens will couple with the AI tab on the mount. When you turn the lens aperture ring, the AI tab will move accordingly so that the camera knows the lens aperture setting. The F mount with an AI tab is the second variation of F mount. A Nikon lens with an AI coupling ridge is called AI lens. The previous lens without this AI coupling ridge is called pre-AI lens or non-AI lens. At that time, lots of Nikon users still have old non-AI lens. Can these non-AI lenses still be used on the newer cameras? Generally speaking, you can't put a non-AI lens to a camera with an AI tab because the AI tab will interfere with the lens bottom without the coupling ridge. However, you can modify the non-AI lens and convert it to AI lens. What you do is to cut a piece out of the ring and make a slot at the bottom and to make a coupling ridge. Lots of people do it by themselves, and there are videos on YouTube to show you how to do it. With early models of the second variation cameras, there is a small button beside the AI tab. You can push the button and flip the AI tab up so that the tab does not interfere with the lens bottom anymore. This way, you can put the old non-AI lens to the camera. Push the button and flip the tab and put the non-AI lens to the camera. However, the AI tab won't move when you turn the aperture ring, and the meter won't work. You can press the depth of preview button to stop down the aperture, and the meter will work. This is not ideal because it is not maximum aperture metering. The viewfinder will be dark, but at least you can use the old lens. Early model second variation cameras include Nikon FT3, Nikon EL2, Nikon FM, FE, F2A, F2AS, and F3. Later autofocus camera F4 also have this feature of flipping up AI tab. F5 and F6 can be modified by Nikon to include this feature of flipping up AI tab. With late model of second variation cameras, the AI tab is fixed. You can't flip the AI tab up. Non-AI lens won't mount. These cameras include Nikon FM2, FE2, EM, FG, FG20, FA, FM10, FE10, and FM3A. In late 1980s, Nikon introduced autofocus SLR. Autofocus SLR uses third variation of F-mount. The most apparent addition to the mount is autofocus drive. Unlike Canon's approach to autofocusing by incorporating focusing motor in the lens, Nikon's initial approach is putting the focusing motor in the camera body. The motor moves the autofocusing drive on the lens mount, which looks like a screw drive. And the screw drive engages the slot on the lens bottom. As you can see, there is a slot on the lens bottom, and the screw drive on the lens mount engages this slot on the lens bottom to do autofocusing. With third variation, the lens mount not only has the AI tab, but also has CPU contacts. We call the autofocus lenses CPU lenses. We call manual focus lenses non-CPU lenses. The CPU contacts communicate between the lens and the camera body, transmitting lens data such as focal length and the aperture setting to the camera. Autofocus cameras not only have manual metering or M mode and aperture priority or A mode, but also have shutter priority or S mode and the program or P mode. As you can see, there is P mode, S mode, A mode, and M mode. With M mode and A mode, you change the aperture by turning the aperture ring on the lens. With S mode and P mode, you don't change aperture. The aperture is changed automatically by the camera. That's why you set the aperture ring at minimum position and leave it there when you use S mode and P mode. Now comes the question, how can the camera change the aperture when the aperture ring does not move? The trick is at the bottom of the lens. There is an aperture control lever. When you move the lever, the aperture changes. In S mode and P mode, the camera changes aperture by moving this lever instead of turning the aperture ring. This is different from the second variation, F mount. With the second variation, aperture can only be set on the lens ring. With the third variation, aperture can also be set on the camera body through the aperture control lever. You might have noticed that non-CPU lenses also have this aperture control lever at the bottom. Now, can a third variation camera use a non-CPU lens and move this lever in S mode and P mode just as it does with a CPU lens? With Nikon's first autofocus camera, F501, even with earlier cameras, FG, FA, and F301, you can use a non-CPU AI lens in program mode. However, after F501, all Nikon autofocus cameras need CPU lenses in order to use P mode and S mode. With CPU lenses, there is a linear relationship between the lever moving distance and the aperture opening. If this doesn't sound like English to you, it simply means the lever moving distance and the aperture opening is precisely correlated. And this is not true with previous AI lenses. With those lenses, the aperture changes when you move the lever, but you don't know exactly how much. Only when Nikon introduced AIS lenses, the precise relationship of lever moving distance and aperture opening is established. All Nikon CPU lenses are AIS lenses. Therefore, with the CPU lenses, the aperture can be better controlled in P mode and S mode. The third variation can also be divided into early models and late models. Early model cameras include F501, F601, F801, F70, F90, and F4. With early models, in M and A modes, aperture is set on the lens ring. In S and P modes, aperture is set on the camera body. These cameras can use AI manual focus lenses in M and A modes, can use AF lenses in M, A, P, and S modes. What about G lenses? G lens has CPU contacts, so the camera can use the aperture control lever to change the aperture in P and S modes. Since G lens has no aperture ring, it can't couple with the AI tab on the third variation mount. Therefore, it has no M mode or A mode. For late models, the lens mount is the same as the early models, but the aperture is set on the camera all the time. Late model cameras of the third variation include f100, f5, f6, d1, d2, d3, d4, d5, d6, d850, d810, d800, d780, d750, d700, d610, d600, d500, d300, d200, d7200, d7100, d7000, and df. Like the early models, late model cameras can use AI manual focus lenses in M and A modes, can use AF lenses in M, A, P, and S modes. Unlike the early models, the late models can use G lenses in all modes, not just P mode and S mode. Besides, the late models take advantage of VR lenses for image stabilization, so late models have wider lens compatibility than early models. Now let's discuss the fourth variation of the F mount. The fourth variation is a downgrade of the third variation. There is no AI tab on the lens mount anymore. As a result, the camera can't engage the AI coupling ridge on the AI lenses. Therefore, the camera won't meter with manual focus lenses. It can still meter with CPU lenses because they have CPU contacts. You may ask, without the AI tab, how can the camera feel the lens is set to its minimum aperture? The answer is an added minimum aperture lever on the lens mount. AF lenses have a minimum aperture tab. And when you turn the aperture ring to its minimum value, this tab will touch the minimum aperture lever on the lens mount, and the camera will know the lens is set to minimum aperture properly. This is the minimum aperture lever on the lens mount, and this is the minimum aperture tag on the lens. Right now, the aperture ring is not set at minimum value. And when you turn it and set to minimum aperture value, then it touches the minimum aperture lever, and the camera knows that the aperture is set to minimum properly. The fourth variation also has early and late models. The early models of the fourth variation include F401, F60, F80, F55, F65, F75, D50, D70, D80, D90, and D100. The late models include D40, D60, D3000, D3100, D3200, D3300, D5000, the 5100, the 5200, the 5300, the 5500, the 5600, and the 7500. In the early models of the fourth variation, the minimum aperture lever moves sideways, and it will interfere with non-AI lenses. Therefore, non-AI lenses cannot mount on these cameras. In the late models of the fourth variation, the minimum aperture lever moves up and down and won't interfere with non-AI lenses. Non-AI lenses can mount on the camera, but without metering. Another major difference between early models and late models is that the late models don't have autofocus drive except the 7500. You can tell a camera has autofocus drive when you see an AF drive lug on the lens mount. This lug will couple with the AF notch on the lens bottom and drive the lens to the right focusing distance. The late models don't have this lug, meaning it won't drive the AF or AFD lenses. With these lenses, you have to manual focus. The camera has to use lenses that have internal focusing motor, such as AFS lenses and AFI lenses, in order to autofocus. Finally, there is a fifth variation of F-mount. The fifth variation of F-mount relies completely on CPU contacts. It does not have the minimum aperture lever on the fourth variation mount. Therefore, it can't meter with AF lenses with aperture ring. Since it does not have AI tab or minimum aperture lever, it won't interfere with any Nikon lenses. You can put any Nikon SLR lenses on it, but only G lenses and AFP lenses have metering capability. To conclude this video, I summarized the 5 variations of Nikon F mount in this chart. The first row lists the 5 variations. The second row indicates the metering mechanism. For example, for the first variation, metering is through the rabbit ear on the lens and the coupling pin on the camera. For the second variation, metering is through the AI tab on the mount. The next row indicates if the AI tab can be flipped up or not. If yes, it can use non-AI lenses. The next row indicates how aperture is controlled. It's either through the aperture ring or the aperture control lever. If it's controlled through the lever, you set the aperture on the camera, not on the lens. The next row is focusing mode. MF means manual focusing. AF in body means autofocusing with the motor drive in the camera body. AF in lens means autofocusing with the motor drive in the lens, which are AFS and AFI lenses, and cannot autofocus with AFD lenses without built-in motor. The next row lists all cameras and their lens compatibility. M means manual metering mode. A means aperture priority. P means program mode. S means shutter priority mode. N means you cannot mount lens to the camera. NM means you can put lens on the camera but without metering. Stop down means metering by pressing depth of field preview button to stop down the aperture. I know you can find Nikon lens compatibility chart online elsewhere. My video and my chart try to help you understand the compatibility, why certain lenses match certain models. Thank you for watching.